Islamic History, about 622 to 627, Notebook from Medina, Part 1. Way back, when we were still in pre-Hijra times, that's 610 to 622 in Mecca, I put together what I call a notebook. It's a throwback term from newspapers from simpler times, when stories were measured in inches and objectivity was actually an objective. When you had just a bunch of stuff you wanted to put out there, but space did not allow it, or it just never quite fit into any larger story of the usual 15 to 20 inches. With history, this is mostly stuff that just didn't fit in anywhere else. Little tidbits that might not be crucial to the historical story, but that I think are still interesting nonetheless. Or maybe stories that were just too short for an episode. But it's also stuff that doesn't quite fit into neat timelines. And this would also include things I just plain forgot to put in when I made an episode about a particular event. So that said, let's go right into it. First story. This is about Abu Qais ibn Abu Anas. Now, there is an obscure figure in the Muslim histories, kind of a pre-Islamic spiritual seeker that goes by the name of Abu Qais ibn Abu Anas. Now, from what little that we know of him, he lived in the same area as Muhammad, living most of his life before Muhammad started his prophetic career. But it is said that this particular guy, Abu Qais ibn Abu Anas, he tried Christianity, and it didn't take. Now, we're not told why it didn't take exactly, but despite having no religion, he lived as a righteous pagan, we are told. Now, what does that mean? What is a righteous pagan? Well, I think it means he instinctually refrained from the things he would later be told were unclean, a sort of a Muslim version of natural law. Now, the major things I've seen mentioned were staying away from idols, washing regularly, and not having sex with women during their periods. So he would become a Muslim when Muhammad came to Medina. Again, not much is said about this guy. So, why mention him? Well, two reasons. One, he represents the pre-Islamic prototype of a person, the Hanif, the righteous pagan, the person who does right even though he has not been instructed how to do right. The men of this type are viewed favorably by Muslims. It's in a way similar to how Christians would view men like Aristotle or Cicero or Virgil. Virgil is who famously guided Dante through hell in the Divine Comedy. Now, these were righteous men of the Greco-Roman world who knew something of the true God, and certainly would have been Christians if they had lived after Christ, or so we tend to think. And similarly, this man embodied Arab cultural values that predated the religion, Islam, that would take over his particular culture. And of course, those values would be different in Arabia than they would have been in the Greco-Roman world. Which is the second reason I mention this person. Because this person, being a notable Arab, he was also a poet. And he left behind some poetry that made the Islamic histories. Now, I don't know if he was actually any good as a poet. I'm not a good judge of poetry in English, let alone Arabic. And it does seem, in that time and place where this person lived, poets really were a dime a dozen, and perhaps he was one of those. But that's not really the point. The point is there were some lines in his poetry that caught my eye. So I want to share a few of those lines that were taken from a larger poem that focuses on virtue. This translation is by Alfred Guillaume. I don't actually know how to pronounce that. Guillaume. Praise God at every dawn. When his sun rises at the new moon, he knows what is clear and not clear to us. What our Lord says is without error. His are the birds which fly to and fro and shelter in nests in their mountain retreats. His are the wild creatures of the desert, which you see on the dunes and in the shade of sandhills. Him the Jews worship and follow. Every dreary custom you can think of. Him the Christians worship and keep. Every feast and festival of their Lord. His is the self-defying monk you see, a prisoner of misery, though once right happy. So we have a shout out to Jews and Christians, and that's nice. But if I'm reading this right, those last two lines are even more interesting because they have something brutally honest to say about the spiritual seeker, and something that you won't really hear very often about a person who has found God. Let me repeat those lines. His, meaning God's, is the self-denying monk you see, a prisoner of misery, though once right happy. Now, I'm assuming for this that he's referring to himself. It's possible he's referring to some other random monk, but I think most likely he's talking about himself. Either way, the point still holds. Because if you look at this, at first, that all sounds backwards. His, meaning God's, is the self-denying monk you see, a prisoner of misery, though once right happy. That's backwards, isn't it? This man found God, so shouldn't it be a man now happy, though once a prisoner of misery? And for the most part, that is the attitude of the believer. But sometimes, and I think that's what this is getting at, when doing the hard work required of your faith, you can very easily fall back with nostalgia on the earlier times, the easier times, when you fit in with the culture, when you thought only of yourself, when you chased pleasure and frequently found it. And you think of those days, and Satan whispers in your ear, hey, you were happy once, you know, and now look at you. Look at the drudgery that is your life. Now, this is obviously a lie, but it's something a good and honest poet cannot ignore. You see the same device being used in the two lines we see here on Judaism, where he writes, him, in referring to God, him the Jews worship and follow, every dreary custom you can think of. Now, this is not a criticism of Jewish custom. It's emphasizing the work involved in remembering and keeping God's law. And commentators on this have noted that the Arab word here, it even invokes a miserable, incurable disease to describe this, the keeping of Jewish law. So again, this doesn't seem like a strong endorsement, but funny enough, it actually is. The rest of the poem goes on to tell people to beware of the world and to obey God all the same. And not even because it will make you happy, obeying God, which is a very interesting twist here. You know, perhaps the ultimate reward is implied, but it never says here, obey God because it will make you happy. It says, obey God because he is God. You know, you may be a prisoner of misery, though once right happy, but the poet is actually embracing and celebrating that condition, his submission to God. Now, again, I'm not a poetry expert. I'm not even really a poetry novice. I'm not qualified to criticize poetry, but I just thought this would be worth mentioning because I'm just so struck by the honesty and the sincerity of that. And it's something a genuine religious seeker can really relate to. And it's even more interesting, when shown in contrast to the modern prosperity gospel, the preaching so common in my country, and the general idea among Western folks that God, if he exists, well, he's there to make sure that you constantly feel good and have an easy life and will continue an even easier life in heaven. And this poem so cleverly dismisses that concept. And that's what really grabbed my attention here. This is just a statement of a reality. And then it comes with orders to follow that reality. Why believe something? Well, really, because it's true. Here's reality. Follow that reality to its logical conclusion. Your happiness is beside the point. Your comfort is beside the point. Your understanding of everything that the master of the universe does is definitely beside the point. God is God, and you have your orders from God. Now go and carry them out. This is the story of the Jewish Arab tribe of the Banu Qaynuqa. That's Qaynuqa. Now, we spent plenty of time with the expelled Jewish tribe of the Banu Nadir, and we went over the execution of the Banu Qaynuqa after the Battle of the Trench. Hopefully you remember that. However, I did pass over the very first instance of Muhammad clashing militarily with a Jewish tribe. And like the other two incidents, this one has plenty of ammunition for those people who, shall we say, are a bit more cynical or secular about Muhammad and his actions in Medina. And even if you are not cynical or secular, it is historically important. So shame on me for leaving this out because it's small, but it's important, which I guess makes it perfect notebook material. And if you look at the expulsion of the Banu Nadir as a cynical land grab that was justified by a phony assassination attempt, and if you view the killing of the Banu Qaynuqa as a brutal show of power, for any remaining dissenters out there, this story, the expulsion of the Banu Qaynuqa, it'll sound familiar. And if you view those actions as unfortunate but righteous, you'll actually still see the same pattern here. Now, the reason it is usually omitted in histories of Islam is that it is a rather small chapter, and very little is actually known about it. Now, what makes it significant, though, is the timing as the first of these episodes, and the start of the likely belief among Medinan Muslims that the Jewish tribes just cannot be trusted. This story, the story of this type, is very familiar in Jewish history. This is something that starts as some kind of isolated incident and then turns into a riot, and then the incident is used to expel the Jews from the community, or possibly even worse than that. Now, in this case, the incident in question, it happened in the marketplace. And we went over this in the final episode of the Battle of the Trench. Someone from the Banu Qaynuqa tribe tricked a Muslim woman into showing her legs. A Muslim man killed that man. Then a Jewish man killed that man. Then the Jews were accused of trashing Muhammad in public, and it eventually led to a siege and a surrender. Now, apparently Muhammad wanted to kill them all, but in this case, their old ally, the Khazraj, convinced Muhammad not to do it, and they were expelled instead. And as we went over, when something similar happened with the Banu Qaynuqa, and the pleading tribe would have been the Aus rather than the Khazraj, all male members of the tribe were killed rather than expelled. But again, not to confuse things, that was the Banu Qaynuqa after the Battle of the Trench, the Siege of Medina. This is the Banu Qaynuqa, Qaynuqa. So this kind of rhymes with the other questionable run-ins between Jews and Muslims in Medina, including a justifying incident that may or may not have happened. Like I've said before, this all depends on your opinion of Muhammad and what he claimed to be and what his motivations were. But I wanted to highlight this one because it is often forgotten. And the Banu Qaynuqa did not come back to fight another day, as the Banu Nadir did. And they didn't go down as Jewish martyrs like the Banu Qaynuqa. For these people, after their expulsion, the Qaynuqa just sort of faded away, and they were never heard from again. And looking back, this was clearly a harbinger of what was to come for the Jews in Medina. This was just the first of them. And now the story of Muhayyisa and Huwayyisa. So speaking of Jewish-Muslim relations, this is a story of two non-Jewish brothers and the death of a Jewish person. Now, this is one of those stories you are definitely not going to hear at a mosque very often, and you'll see why in a minute. Because from a certain perspective, this can be seen as righteous, but if I was preaching as an imam, just the sheer amount of rationalizing and qualifying that you would have to do, it simply would not be worth the effort of including this story in anything, nor would be fending off inquiries from the FBI, or maybe even attention from the Mossad. Now, before I tell the story, I want to preface this by telling you how this story is portrayed in the early histories, the point they were trying to make. Now, the actions of the younger brother who kills someone, they are presented as positive. This is a lesson for Muslims. This is a person to emulate. And this is not an allegory or a parable. These are two real people doing what is presented as a real thing. They even have names, Muhayyisa and Huwayyisa, from the Aus tribe of Medina. That said, here's the story. It grips you from the start, which is why this was something that, while not worthy of an episode, it certainly merits a notebook mention, because it really, really grabs your attention. Now, the official version of this starts with the words, "The prophet said, kill any Jews that come into your power." Now, regardless of what that actually means, that is some fantastic attention-grabbing writing. You just cannot read on after you see that. You see what I mean by it just not being worth explaining this if you were to tell this story as an imam. Now, if you're a Muslim, the main defense would be that Muhammad never issued a general directive to kill all Jews. And that Muslim would probably be correct. Now, we have no evidence of some kind of SS decree from on high. Now, the odds are much more likely this was an isolated incident, if it actually happened. I mean, it's well documented. So if you believe the Hadith traditions, yeah, this actually happened. And for what it's worth, personally, I think it's probably true. But regardless of what Muhammad actually said in this instance, the writer of this story clearly believed there was a call to kill Jews wherever and whenever you could. The moral of the story is related to the two brothers and how seriously they took that directive. Now, a time isn't given either, so this could be almost any time between the Hijra and a few years before Muhammad died, but probably in the first few years after the Hijra at 622. And one account mentions the Battle of Uhud had happened shortly thereafter, so that should give you possibly a better time frame. So we have Huwayyisa with an H. Huwayyisa, the older brother. He is dealing with a Jewish business associate. And he's sometimes named, sometimes not. Speculation is that it was a man named Ibn Sunayna. Now, I was going to say, well, his name's not important. And I suppose historically it's not. But considering he's a murder victim here, it would seem a bit unfair not to name him. So, Ibn Sunayna. Anyway, Huwayyisa is dealing with his business partner, his Jewish business partner. And I should note that Huwayyisa is not yet a Muslim. So then his brother comes along, who is a Muslim. Now his name is Muhayyisa. So we have the older brother, Huwayyisa, and the younger brother, Muhayyisa. If you want an easy way to remember that, H comes before M in the alphabet. So H would be the older brother, Huwayyisa. M would be the younger brother, Muhayyisa. All right, so along comes little brother, Muhayyisa. And he kills the Jewish man. And of course, Huwayyisa just flips out. Saying, what is the matter with you? He's my business partner. Do you have any idea how much money you just cost me? And Muhayyisa justifies his actions, noting that Islam comes before everything else. And because the Prophet said to kill that man, he was going to kill that man. Now, eventually, Huwayyisa's anger abates, and he's impressed with the religious zeal of his younger brother. And because of this, he eventually converts to Islam. So, yeah, that is a moral minefield right there. But the good you are supposed to take away from this is, in the original content, is that Islam is more important than money, as represented by the Jewish partner. And that Islam is even more important than family, as represented by the older brother. And there's also supposed to be virtue in the zealotry and the faith of the younger brother, because that is what eventually convinces the older brother to embrace Islam. This is what Christians would call witness. The witness of the early martyrs across Rome is what caused Christianity to take over most areas of the empire before it was even legal to be a Christian. It was the witness. People see you and say, I want to be like those people. I want to have the faith they have, to have the peace and certainty that they have. Of course, you can see how that's a bit different than our story here. And if you're preaching this in a modern context, it is way, way easier to hold up the Christians in the Roman arena as virtuous than this particular young man killing a Jewish merchant for being Jewish, basically. Like I said earlier, that's a pretty difficult one to explain. Not that it's impossible, but the explanation would be so long and so detailed, it just probably wouldn't be worth including in a sermon. That is, unless you were some kind of a masochistic imam who really, really loved to challenge. And I suppose if someone was forced to preach on this topic, let's say an imam in training is given this topic to preach on, so he has to do it. He might say something like, zeal and obedience are important. But he would also give the caveat that you should probably consult with authorities before doing anything that cannot be reversed. By authorities, I mean religious authorities. You wouldn't want to do something like killing a guy because you think Muhammad wanted you to do it. That's not enough. It's better to know for sure that Muhammad wants you to do this. But the rest is, like I said, a minefield. The original histories hold up the young man as pure and full of virtue, but doing that in the modern age, particularly in a Western country, frankly, it really would attract some attention from law enforcement. And that's probably not worth it, which is also probably why very few people have heard this story. Thank you, and I'll talk to you next time. Inshallah.